Hello, I'm Shaun Richards of Notayesmaneconomics. Today I want to talk to you about France, in particular the French economy. So far in 2018, it's seen quite a struggle. If we look at the actual official data that we have, which covers the first half of the year, we've seen in the first two quarters it grew by only 0.2%. So 0.2, 0.2. This is quite a drop on the previous numbers that were 0.6, 0.7. So that's quite a reverse. The French numbers can be a bit erratic like that, but not so often 2 quarters in a row. Usually it's one that appears out of sequence. This provokes quite a few thoughts because as we look around, we see, for example, in terms of monetary policy, that the European Central Bank has been winding it back, winding its stimulus back. What we've seen so far in terms of that is the way that the monthly purchases of government bonds, we would call QE, have been reducing. So now they're at 15 billion euros a month. At the end of the year, they'll go to zero. So there will remain a total amount on the book, which in the case of France is 410 billion euros worth of French bonds that the ECB's bought, but there won't be extra purchases going forwards. So if you like, if you're a follower of my line of thought, that some of the growth we saw in the euro is a type of junkie culture, just simply following the monetary stimulus, then the French numbers are particularly troubling because as it's got wound down, the growth has gone. Now, it's always dangerous, directly leading from one thing to another, but it does make you think. This morning, that's been backed up again. If we look at the situation for French households and what they think, they're quite downbeat. Now, this particular series that the French Statistics Office produces has been around for 31 years, so it does have a track record. And it not only is saying that things are getting worse, which you can see the numbers reducing so far this year, but the latest figure for September at 94 is below the long-run average of 100. If you look at the period during the euro era, current number of 94 compares quite badly with the 120 plus that the euro era began with back around in the year 2000. Numbers were very strong then, before the dip driven by 9/11. So we can see that there's been a shift. It's downwards, people are less optimistic. Now that's not just France, I think, that's a general thing, that we haven't seen the recovery from the credit crunch that people would have hoped. But France has been a particular case at this, because as well as the decline, it did actually snap back if we look at sort of 2010 and 2011, but then the euro area crisis hit it again. So what we're seeing now is France had an improvement late 2016, 2017, but that seems to have gone. So there's a lot of questions posed here. The new president, Macron, is supposed to be business friendly, and indeed we're seeing some of that. He's certainly big business friendly because there were tax cuts for them last time around. The budget announced on Monday has brought more of the same. So of the roughly 24 billion euros of tax cuts, 6 billion is for households, some 18 billion are for business. So we see that there are manoeuvrings in the system, but then this brings us to another issue. What do you get if economic growth's disappointed? Well, you find that your issues in terms of public debt start to get out of control. So we see now, just under 98%, that the national debt to GDP ratio is not out of control, but perhaps worrying. Why might it worry again? Well, if there isn't any economic growth, which brings me back to where I begin. This number got better, and so have the French deficit numbers annually. Why? Because it saw a little bit of economic growth. If that's now going to fade away again, we find ourselves in a situation where that will slip away. And one has to be careful here because there's several factors at play at the same time. For example, as well as the better period for economic growth, France saw the ECB QE programme, which made its debt costs incredibly cheap. Issuing new debt was, it's an exaggeration to say for nothing, but not a lot more than that. Now looking forward, say growth slows down, the ECB is no longer buying, France could see debt costs as well, and some of these metrics could start to slip away. As to what can be done about this is a bit problematic because it brings us, to some extent like Italy, although France has been stronger than Italy, a problem of a long-term situation here where growth hasn't really quite ever got up on a sustained basis, I mean. Looking round at the various numbers, we see that some of the private sector surveys are trying to tell us that things are doing reasonably well. If you look at the market numbers, they're PMIs, also the French official surveys, they say that things are better than average. Except again, I return you to the first quarter where things are actually quite poor. Moving on to the way that the Bank of France looks at it, in some ways that's quite downbeat. The optimistic side is it's still expecting growth of 1.6% this year, which is optimistic because if you've only had 0.4 in the first half of the year, now got to be 1.2% for those numbers to come through. But I noticed in add-ons to that it says that's above potential. This is a familiar thing for central banks these days. You see the Bank of England saying the UK speed limit's 1.5%. But France, particularly here, seems to be struggling. It still has quite high unemployment levels, more than double that in the UK. So there's a lot to think through. Let me present it to you in another form. If you look at Macron, he's presented tax cuts for business. Well, that's not considered very popular when Trump does it, is it? So there's various issues here to look at, but the factor I want you to sort of walk away with and think about today is France is struggling. Say this was the UK. The media would be all over it. For some reason, it's mostly being ignored. But if France slows down in the second half of the year, in the same vein that it has in the first, it's going to pose a lot of questions for the European Central Bank, the Euro project itself, and actually for us here over in the UK. We do quite a lot of business with France. So it's not something that we want, but it is something that looks like it's happening. Thank you.